The Hiramic Legend Part 2. Albert Pike mentions several forms of the name Chiram, Kurm, Korm, and Kur-Om, the latter ending in the sacred Hindu monosyllable Om, which may also be extracted from the names of the three murderers. Pike further relates the three ruffians to a triad of stars in the constellation of Libra and also calls attention to the fact that the Chaldean god Baal, metamorphosed into a demon by the Jews, appears in the name of each of the murderers, Jubela, Jubilo, and Jubilum. To interpret the Hiramic legend requires familiarity with both the Pythagorean and Kabbalistic systems of numbers and letters, and also the philosophic and astronomic cycles of the Egyptians, Chaldeans, and Brahmins. For example, consider the number 33. The first temple of Solomon stood for 33 years in its pristine splendor. At the end of that time it was pillaged by the Egyptian king Shishak, and finally, 588 BC, it was completely destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar, and the people of Jerusalem were led into captivity to Babylon. See General History of Freemasonry, by Robert McCoy. Also, King David ruled for 33 years in Jerusalem. The Masonic order is divided into 33 symbolic degrees. There are 33 segments in the human spinal column. And Jesus was crucified in the 33rd year of his life. The efforts made to discover the origin of the Hiramic legend show that, while the legend in its present form is comparatively modern, its underlying principles run back to remotest antiquity. It is generally admitted by modern Masonic scholars that the story of the martyred Chiram is based upon the Egyptian rites of Osiris, whose death and resurrection figuratively portrayed the spiritual death of man and his regeneration through initiation into the mysteries. Chiram is also identified with Hermes through the inscription on the Emerald Table. From these associations it is evident that Chiram is to be considered as a prototype of humanity. In fact, he is Plato's idea, archetype, of man. As Adam after the fall symbolizes the idea of human degeneration, so Chiram through his resurrection symbolizes the idea of human regeneration. On the 19th day of March, 1314, Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templars, was burned on a pyre erected upon that point of the islet of the Seine, at Paris, where afterwards was erected the statue of King Henry IV. See The Indian Religions, by Hargrave Jennings. It is mentioned as a tradition in some of the accounts of the burning, writes Jennings, that Molay, ere he expired, summoned Clement, the Pope who had pronounced the bull of abolition against the order and had condemned the Grand Master to the flames, to appear, within 40 days, before the Supreme Eternal Judge, and Philip, the King, to the same awful tribunal within the space of a year. Both predictions were fulfilled. The close relationship between Freemasonry and the original Knights Templars has caused the story of Chiram to be linked with the martyrdom of Jacques de Molay. According to this interpretation, the three ruffians who cruelly slew their master at the gates of the temple because he refused to reveal the secrets of his order represent the Pope, the King, and the executioners. De Molay died maintaining his innocence and refusing to disclose the philosophical and magical arcana of the Templars. Those who have sought to identify Chiram with the murdered King Charles the First conceive the Hiramic legend to have been invented for that purpose by Elias Ashmole, a mystical philosopher, who was probably a member of the Rosicrucian fraternity. Charles was dethroned in 1647, and died on the block in 1649, leaving the Royalist party leaderless. An attempt has been made to relate the term, the sons of the widow, an appellation frequently applied to members of the Masonic order, to this incident in English history. For by the murder of her king, England became a widow, and all Englishmen, widows' sons. To the mystic Christian Mason, Chiram represents the Christ who in 3 degrees, raised the temple of his body from its earthly sepulchre. His three murderers were Caesar's agent, the state, the Sanhedrin, the church, and the incited populace, the mob. Thus considered, Chiram becomes the higher nature of man and the murderers are ignorance, superstition, and fear. The indwelling Christ can give expression to himself in this world only through man's thoughts, feelings, and actions. Right thinking, right feeling, and right action, these are three gates through which the Christ power passes into the material world, there to labor in the erection of the temple of universal brotherhood. Ignorance, superstition, and fear are three ruffians through whose agencies the spirit of good is murdered and a false kingdom, controlled by wrong thinking, wrong feeling, and wrong action, established in its stead. In the material universe, evil appears ever victorious. In this sense, writes Daniel Sickles, the myth of the Tyrian is perpetually repeated in the history of human affairs. Orpheus was murdered, and his body thrown into the Hebrus. Socrates was made to drink the hemlock, and, in all ages, we have seen evil temporarily triumphant, and virtue and truth calumniated, persecuted, crucified, and slain. But eternal justice marches surely and swiftly through the world. The Typhons, the children of darkness, the plotters of crime, all the infinitely varied forms of evil, are swept into oblivion. And truth and virtue, for a time laid low, come forth, clothed with diviner majesty, and crowned with everlasting glory. See General Ahiman Rezan. If, as there is ample reason to suspect, the modern Freemasonic order was profoundly influenced by, if it is not an actual outgrowth of, Francis Bacon's secret society, its symbolism is undoubtedly permeated with Bacon's two great ideals, universal education and universal democracy. The deadly enemies of universal education are ignorance, superstition, and fear, by which the human soul is held in bondage to the lowest part of its own constitution. The errant enemies of universal democracy have ever been the crown, the tiara, and the torch. Thus Chiram symbolizes that ideal state of spiritual, intellectual, and physical emancipation which has ever been sacrificed upon the altar of human selfishness. Chiram is the beautifier of the eternal house. Modern utilitarianism, however, sacrifices the beautiful for the practical, in the same breath declaring the obvious lie that selfishness, hatred, and discord are practical. Dr. Orville Ward Owen found a considerable part of the first 32 degrees of Freemasonic ritualism hidden in the text of the first Shakespeare folio. Masonic emblems are to be observed also upon the title pages of nearly every book published by Bacon. Sir Francis Bacon considered himself as a living sacrifice upon the altar of human need. He was obviously cut down in the midst of his labors, and no student of his New Atlantis can fail to recognize the Masonic symbolism contained therein. According to the observations of Joseph Fort Newton, the Temple of Solomon described by Bacon in the Utopian romance was not a house at all but the name of an ideal state. Is it not true that the Temple of Freemasonry is also emblematic of a condition of society? While, as before stated, the principles of the Hiramic legend are of the greatest antiquity, it is not impossible that its present form may be based upon incidents in the life of Lord Bacon, who passed through the philosophic death and was raised in Germany. In an old manuscript appears the statement that the Freemasonic order was formed by alchemists and Hermetic philosophers, who had banded themselves together to protect their secrets against the infamous methods used by avaricious persons to wring from them the secret of gold making. The fact that the Hiramic legend contains an alchemical formula gives credence to this story. Thus the building of Solomon's temple represents the consummation of the magnum opus, which cannot be realized without the assistance of Chiram, the universal agent. The Masonic mysteries teach the initiate how to prepare within his own soul a miraculous powder of projection by which it is possible for him to transmute the base lump of human ignorance, perversion, and discord into an ingot of spiritual and philosophic gold. Sufficient similarity exists between the Masonic Chiram and the Kundalini of Hindu mysticism to warrant the assumption that Chiram may be considered a symbol also, of the spirit fire, moving through the sixth ventricle of the spinal column. The exact science of human regeneration is the lost key of Masonry, for when the spirit fire is lifted up through the 33 degrees, or segments of the spinal column, and enters into the domed chamber of the human skull, it finally passes into the pituitary body, Isis, where it invokes Ra, the pineal gland, and demands the sacred name. Operative Masonry, in the fullest meaning of that term, signifies the process by which the eye of Horus is opened. E.A. Wallace Budge has noted that in some of the papyri illustrating the entrance of the souls of the dead into the judgment hall of Osiris, the deceased person has a pine cone attached to the crown of his head. The Greek mystics also carried a symbolic staff, the upper end being in the form of a pine cone, which was called the thyrsus of Bacchus. In the human brain there is a tiny gland called the pineal body, which is the sacred eye of the ancients, and corresponds to the third eye of the Cyclops. Little is known concerning the function of the pineal body, which Descartes suggested, more wisely than he knew, might be the abode of the spirit of man. As its name signifies, the pineal gland is the sacred pine cone in man, the eye single, which cannot be opened until Chiram, the spirit fire, is raised through the sacred seals which are called the 7 churches in Asia. There is an oriental painting which shows 3 sunbursts. One sunburst covers the head, in the midst of which sits Brahma with 4 heads, his body a mysterious dark color. The second sunburst, which covers the heart, solar plexus, and upper abdominal region, shows Vishnu sitting in the blossom of the lotus on a couch formed of the coils of the serpent of cosmic motion, its 7 hooded head forming a canopy over the god. The third sunburst is over the generative system, in the midst of which sits Shiva, his body a grayish white, and the Ganges river flowing out of the crown of his head. This painting was the work of a Hindu mystic who spent many years subtly concealing great philosophical principles within these figures. The Christian legends could be related also to the human body by the same method as the Oriental, for the arcane meanings hidden in the teachings of both schools are identical. As applied to Masonry, the 3 sunbursts represent the gates of the temple at which Chiram was struck. There being no gate in the north because the sun never shines from the northern angle of the heavens. The north is the symbol of the physical because of its relation to ice, crystallized water, and to the body, crystallized spirit. In man the light shines toward the north but never from it, because the body has no light of its own but shines with the reflected glory of the divine life. Particles concealed within physical substance. For this reason the moon is accepted as the symbol of man's physical nature. Chiram is the mysterious fiery, airy water which must be raised through the 3 grand centers symbolized by the ladder with 3 rungs and the sunburst flowers mentioned in the description of the Hindu painting. It must also pass upward by means of the ladder of 7 rungs, the 7 plexuses proximate to the spine. The 9 segments of the sacrum and coccyx are pierced by 10 foramina, through which pass the roots of the tree of life. 9 is the sacred number of man, and in the symbolism of the sacrum and coccyx a great mystery is concealed. That part of the body from the kidneys downward was termed by the early Kabbalists the land of Egypt into which the children of Israel were taken during the captivity. Out of Egypt, Moses, the illuminated mind, as his name implies, led the tribes of Israel, the 12 faculties, by raising the brazen serpent in the wilderness upon the symbol of the Tau cross. Not only Chiram but the god-men of nearly every pagan mystery ritual are personifications of the spirit fire in the human spinal cord. Excerpt from The Secret Teachings of All Ages by Manly P. Hall.